Mr. Steiner, thank you so much for being on our show. And I know it's your first visit to China in 5 years. You interact with many sectors, Department of China, and discussing quite diverse topics with them. So can you first share with us your outcomes or results of this visit to China so far?
The occasion was the China Council for International Cooperation and Environment Development, in which I also serve as a vice chair. And this China Council, to which I have contributed over 20 years now, is the premier forum where China engages with the international community on environment and development issues. And particularly now that China is beginning the preparations for its next 5-year plan, this is a very critical period to review policies on environment, sustainable development. And we had very fruitful discussions, including on the green transition that is happening in China now, the actions on climate change, but also mobility and other sectors. And then in Beijing, I met with a number of officials from different departments and ministries, because the United Nations Development Programme is a long-standing partner to China's national development. And in particular, in recent years, our focus has been on sustainable development. And so we together reviewed our programs, and I committed UNDP's support to the next phase of China's development also.
Finance is a very key issue to enable to make sure the SDG to be implemented. According to the 2024 Financing for Sustainable Development Report, there are still 4 trillion SDG financing gap. I know you soon will go to Shanghai to have regular meetings about finance. So how do you think UNDP and China can cooperate to together deal with these issues?
First of all, I think we have cooperated also in the past, and one of the success stories of China, one of the enablers, for example, in the massive investment in cleaner technology, was that China 10-15 years ago began to also advance the development of a green financial system and platform in China, working with the People's Bank of China, but also the individual banks, in creating the incentives, because if you don't have access to finance, you cannot invest in innovation in cleaner technology. The bitter truth is that in our world today, we are richer as a global economy than ever before in human history, at least in monetary terms. But what is happening in our world is that wealth is very concentrated. So where there is plenty of money, it's not being invested where people need it. So one of our difficulties is that our financial system is not very effective at creating the incentives and transacting the finance to enable those who actually need to invest to have the money. In most countries, governments have limited financial resources. How do you create an investment environment? So again, we would love to work more with China in supporting many developing countries in modernizing their regulatory frameworks, de-risking the investment environment so that more capital is invested. Another area is, as I mentioned to you earlier, is China's ability also with its own economies of scale, i.e. the more you produce, the cheaper the cost of production per unit of a photovoltaic panel, a wind power turbine, an electric motorbike or car. These are enormous opportunities for poorer countries to now begin to switch to electric mobility or cleaner energy. UNDP has a program called Africa Mini-Grids. In 21 African countries, we are now helping to bring solar mini-grids to the point where investors can actually invest. And if the programs go well, we could connect 250 million African citizens to clean energy supplies over the next 5 to 6 years. Having China also as an investor, as a financier, would be extremely welcome, because that is the way that we help countries to advance. Without electricity, modernization and development are very difficult.
It has been 45 years since UNDP opened an office in China. How would you evaluate the development achievement of China in the past 45 years? And what role has UNDP played in this process?
I think, first of all, it has been a remarkable partnership. 45 years, UNDP was at the time invited by China as one of the first international partners to help it think through in the phase of opening up, but also in the modernization process. Now, if you ask me what are some of the accomplishments, I think it is in part the phases that China passed through. The extraordinary economic transition is certainly one that I think even every Chinese citizen today is still astonished, and certainly the world at large is very impressed by how China has managed to create a dynamic of economic growth, but also of addressing issues such as inequality. And I think this is the second transition that happened, this extraordinary ability to make the economy grow, but also to lift people out of poverty. Almost 750 million people lifted out of poverty is an achievement that I think will forever be associated with this period of rapid and accelerated development, but always keeping an attention on rural areas, but also on those who are left behind, and particularly in rapid economic growth periods. The third transition that I think stands out is the environmental one. And I think what we have seen in this period is a remarkable ability to decouple economic growth, first of all from pollution, and second, to begin to invest in the transition towards a green economy. And look, today China is a country and an economy that I think is beginning to be a leader in many of the sectors that will define the future of power generation, transport and mobility, and other sectors. So these, I would say, are three, I think, major examples that stand out to me.
Currently, the UNDP's work and cooperation with China and all countries is anchored on SDGs. So how are SDGs going in China and globally?
The truth is, we have had many setbacks. When we adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, the world agreed that these are 17 goals that we need to first of all work together on, but each country also needs to rethink its own development approach. We live in a time where the planetary realities of our atmosphere, our biosphere, resource availability have rewritten the script for how development can go forward. We have to share the resources of this planet with 8 billion people, soon maybe 9 or 10 billion people. So we have to produce and consume in a very different way. What happened after 2015 was that there was a universal adoption of the goals, and this was a very good signal. But then the pandemic came, everything was disrupted, and we have not yet really recovered from that pandemic. We face in many countries an economic and financial crisis or very difficult period. We're not able to invest in the innovations and the changes that the SDGs envisaged. These were really transformative agendas. We also are in a world that is more divided, many conflicts, many wars, but in many countries with good choices, we are also advancing. Again, China in many respects is actually moving forward very quickly on a number of the SDGs, and some studies, particularly in the urban centers of China, show very significant progress. So I think it's a mixed balance. Some would argue that because of the lack of progress, maybe the Sustainable Development Goals are no longer relevant. I would argue the opposite. We are in a very difficult period in terms of development, but also international cooperation. The Sustainable Development Goals are not wrong. They actually still point us in the right direction, but we are struggling.
Three very important, crucial UN summits soon will be held on biodiversity, climate change, and desertification. And as we can see, China is playing a very important role. It's a very important contributor, leader to these issues. So, building on the current efforts, what role do you think China can play in these three very important COPs?
I think by definition, China is today a central player, both in terms of its domestic actions, but also in enabling international cooperation. Because countries are always watching each other, and they will move forward if they believe that others are also moving forward. These conference of the parties may sometimes to your listeners seem painfully slow ways of advancing. But imagine how difficult it is to bring 193 nations around the table. Essentially, we have 7.5, 8 billion people negotiating with each other at these conference of the parties. So progress is sometimes slow because we have to advance together. We cannot solve these problems country by country. And that is why I think the approach that China has, for instance, taken in the climate change context is enormously important. It was its own pollution challenge that drove a lot of the cleaning up of industries, of the massive investments in renewable energy. China is today surpassing its commitments under the Paris Agreement. And I think the transition that China now envisages in peaking in carbon emissions and then ultimately becoming also a net zero economy, these are fundamental to also creating the opportunities for other countries to move, not least with the kind of production of technology that is now allowing many countries to invest in renewable energy, electric vehicles, at a much lower cost than they would have done 5-10 years ago. There are many who today question multilateralism. They ask the question, is the United Nations really able to help countries to advance? I would say to your listeners, even in these difficult times, it's interesting that in the next 2 months, we will have the world brought together by the United Nations on climate, on desertification, on biodiversity, and on plastics. And we just had a couple of weeks ago the Summit of the Future at the United Nations General Assembly, where all countries signed on to a pact for the future, reaffirming their commitment to work together. So we have to be realistic. It's difficult, it's sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but multilateralism is fundamental to the ability of humanity to work together in addressing these issues. And the ones you mentioned, climate, desertification, biodiversity, they're existential to human well-being and the future of our planet.
My last question for you, let's talk about the young generation. They are the pillar of future development. From perspective of young generation youth in a world full of uncertainty, Mr. Steiner, how do you think they can stay positive, cultivate a global perspective and achieve their own values?
Let me first of all acknowledge, I think the fact that many of our young people today are feeling uncertain is actually a fact. Uncertainty has many impacts. It makes you unsure about what to do next. It creates fear of the future. It can paralyze you. So let us be clear, there are many things happening in our world today, including these conflicts and geopolitical tensions and wars around the world. Never mind the crisis around climate. I mean, we are now in the phase where climate is no longer the prediction that scientists were giving us 20 years ago. It has become a reality, and it is very scary. So I think what I would say to young people today, you live in a very difficult moment in human history, but actually you also live in an age of possibility. When you look at the ability of countries to actually change course, the ability of a country like China to invest in an environmental sustainability path is, I think, a good reason to be hopeful. Secondly, the advent of technologies, whether it is digital technology, whether it is now artificial intelligence, also represent extraordinary opportunities to do things better, smarter, more efficiently. And I think therein lies perhaps the greatest hope that we are entering an era where if we can come together as humanity, this original idea of the United Nations, we the peoples, preventing war, investing in each other, then for young people the future actually is very bright. There are extraordinary possibilities out there, and I had a dinner last night with some of the tech entrepreneurs that are leading some of the innovations here in China. When I see their energy and their imagination, I myself begin to believe, yes, we can do this, and we will do it, because in the end we owe it to the next generation to give them the possibilities to go a better pathway. And Sabrina, wherever you look in the world, young people are already changing the way things are going to happen right now.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.